It's time for Prove All Things, a Bible discussion program on the Word of God. A panel of preachers will deal with your questions and comments. Prove all things, hold fast that which is good, abstain from all appearance of evil, and the very God of peace sanctify you wholly. Finish it. You might as well tell everybody in the country.
Well, I mean, they were exposed on the 22nd in a small group meeting at church, and anyway, the lady was tested. She is a health worker, and she was tested and found out about it. So she contacted them all today, and of course, my daughter is working at home, but my son is essential worker in defense plant, and he reported that he was exposed today, but they told him they were going to keep him on. They thought the risk was small because they were socially distancing and all of that stuff. That's very important. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens.
Okay, well, we'll be thinking about them.
Yeah.
And it's good to be with all of you today. We hope we've got some folks listening. We're looking forward to talking with you. This is Prove All Things. If you've heard us before, you know pretty well the routine. This is number 204. This program, we depend on your questions and comments for subject matter on this program. We try not to invent it ourselves. Goodness knows where we would go with it. But we're on two platforms. We're on YouTube. Look for the chat button on YouTube, and you can click that, and you can write us, and one of these guys will pick that up and let me know what's going on, what your comment or question is. And we're on Facebook. Everybody knows how to comment on Facebook. We'll do the same thing on Facebook, and we're looking forward to being with you. Program's brought to you by the High School Road Church of Christ, 3103 North High School Road in lovely West Side, Indianapolis, Indiana. And we would like to have you join us here on the program. You might, if you're on Facebook, you might like the program. I hate to tell people to like me, but you might like the program, and you might share it.
Everybody likes you, John.
Well, I've known one or two. And you might share it with your friends, and we'll try to get some more people involved and talking about the Bible. And we've already introduced you to Jeff Asher from downtown Nacogdoches, Texas.
Yes, I'm the oldest man in the oldest city in Texas.
There you go. And over here on my left is Alan McKee.
Hello, John. Good to be with you again.
Who's still hibernating in his house.
That's right.
Working like a dog, right?
Being a troglodyte.
Are you still working hard? They haven't put you on vacation?
No, I'm still getting work done.
Okay. Your wife keeps telling me that you're enjoying working from home. You get something done for a change.
Well, no, because I keep getting pulled into conference calls.
Oh.
Where, you got these little pictures all over the screen. Looks like the Brady Bunch,
Okay. Well, we've heard about all those team building exercises you do, and that sort of thing. Anywho.
I'm not on a team.
You're not on a team? Well, he's on the team, and they'll go out to every restaurant in town. That's over.
Yeah, that's no kidding.
But anyway, we're looking forward to talking with you. Bible questions, Bible comments. I think we covered everything last week that was on the program. We did have one guy who wrote us after the program went off the air. I'm going to click him up here in front of Jeff for just a minute. He identified himself as Dr. J, and we looked him up. I'm not going to give his...
I thought he was a basketball player.
Well, apparently He's the religious Dr. J.
Okay, I don't know him.
And so he, let
I
me,
guess I shouldn't kid you about that.
yeah. Let me see if I've got all this sorted out. Yeah, I do believe. Here's some of the things he said. I'm going to stick this up again in front of Jeffrey. Here we go. Dr. J says that the Church of Christ is good, solid people. However, there are at least 12 items of doctrinal error promoted by this denomination. Just saying, from Dr. J. And he says, I believe the Restoration movement of the 19th century, in spite of its honorable intentions, thank you, actually produced a few doctrinal errors equal to or greater than what they set out to correct, says Dr. J. And then he says, when I left the Glisson Street Church of Christ in Portland, Oregon, he's out west, I think in Oregon or Washington, one or the other, I can't remember. Over 45 years ago, the following is a partial list I submitted to the elders as to my concern over doctrine. So, we're not going to get through that whole list, and we're not even going to get past maybe one or 2 points, especially if one of you will bring up some other question or comment that you have. Anybody in there, have we hooked anybody yet, Engineer Dave?
No, but let me double check.
Ed asked a question.
Okay, we'll wait on Dr. J. We can talk about him anytime.
Jeff is asking, this is a question directed to Jeff.
Uh-oh. What's
Saying,
it?
I want to hear Jeff's thoughts on Psalms 137.
Okay.
Psalms 137.
Didn't want to hear yours, huh?
No, not mine.
Something in particular in mind?
He doesn't say. That's all he says. I would like to hear your thoughts on it.
Goodness gracious.
So
I'm sure you're up on Psalms 137 right now.
I'm sure you have lots of
Well, it's
profound
a
thoughts.
captivity psalm. I was trying to think of.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the psalm.
So I really.
What?
This is one of the ones the Jews sang when they went up to Jerusalem.
Hang on a minute, Jeff. What are you saying, Engineer Dave?
I'm sorry, I'm getting multiple things that aren't showing up on what I was watching. Actually, the first question we had was from Penny.
No. We're on this one now. We'll go back to Penny as soon as we can.
Okay, but okay.
Oh, he said some malfunction. Dave's had a brain problem.
So it's not the 137th Psalm?
Yes, it is 107. Go for it. I gave you a chance to think about it a minute.
Well, I don't know what he wants me to say. It's a song of the captivity. That's all I know to say until I have something else. Does he want me to exegete the whole song?
Well, I wouldn't think so. It is a captivity psalm, obviously. The verse 7, remember, O Lord, the children of Edom, they were the enemies of Israel through that time.
That's either, some people look at that as being the book of Obadiah. Personally, I don't. I think that the Edomites were complicit in the destruction of Jerusalem, in that they hindered those who ran for escape and rejoiced in the destruction of Jerusalem, which has been their thing all along. They just hated the Jews from the time they tried to come in the land there in the book of Exodus.
Ed comments and says nothing in particular, maybe in reference to how Israel was punished and their desire to go back.
Yeah, the verses 37, 38, 39, 37, verse 7 is talking, he wants to hear from you. Excuse me.
Well, the first verse, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. And this reminds me of there in the book of Ezekiel, when they sat there in days for silence, just they mourning the reality. The Jewish leaders had said, this is all going to be over in a couple of years. They're all coming back. Everything's going to be fine. Jeremiah said, well, I don't think you guys are right about that. 70 years is what the Lord has promised you in captivity. And oh no, it's not gonna happen. And then sure enough, it did happen. And now once they're over there in Babylon, they're just like the northern kingdom was. No temple, no priest, no sacrifice at the altar. They're completely cut off from God. And so what do? They hang their harps there on the willows, because the songs of Israel were songs of joy and blessing and comfort and rejoicing in the name of God. And now they're over there. When you think about the 89th Psalm that Asaph writes, and his question is, well, God, we know about all these promises you made, but look at the situation we're in. I got a feeling you're not going to keep your word. And God says, oh, yes, I am. I swore to David just like I swore to Abraham. And when I swear something, I'm going to do it. And Isaiah 55, the sure mercies of David. So these Jews are weeping, but as later some of the prophets will say, why are you weeping? Why are you fasting? That's the book of Zechariah. Were you doing it for me, or were you doing it for yourself? And that's really the issue. Are these people weeping because they're sorry they got caught? Or are they weeping because they're truly penitent before God and they know they've fouled up and they're going to have to repent? Because Solomon said, if my people, when they're in captivity, will look towards this place and pray, then I will heal them and bring. So that's the real issue. And that's what Daniel was doing when they threw him in the lion's den. He was praying 3 times a day that God would bring them back. So, I mean, I don't know what else to say about it. Make a great sermon. I know that.
Okay. David, let's go back to Penny there. She was first. We skipped her.
Okay. Penny asks, during this time, the world is experiencing, many are watching church services on the internet and on YouTube. My question is that some churches of Christ are asking their viewers to partake in the Lord's Supper with them, even though the viewer is alone. Is this biblical?
Alan, what do you think about that?
I feel it's not. And I base that on a reading of 1 Corinthians 11. If we go over there to 1 Corinthians 11, and we look at that verse, and starting in verse 22, starting in verse 20. When you come together, therefore, into one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating, each one takes his own supper, and one is hungry and another is drunken. And what, have you not houses to eat and to drink in, or despise you the church of God, and shame them that have not? What do I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I praise you not. Notice in verse 20, when you come together in one place, he says, he was condemning them. It's not to eat the Lord's Supper, which is what they were ostensibly gathered together to do. If we go, he then describes the Lord's Supper, and he goes down through that description. But then if we get down to the end of this chapter, verse 33, therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. So it is a coming together. It is not every man for himself, and we're all going to sit off in our own little corner and take the Lord's Supper, or sit in our own houses. I even heard of one church that was going to do maybe some kind of a drive-in. Maybe that's not as bad as, at least you're coming together in one place, I suppose, but it was kind of, you drive in your car and you eat the Lord's Supper that way. But, if that's the case, what's the point of coming, what's the point of this verse if it's not to get us to come together? We are to gather with one another when we take the Lord's Supper.
Okay. We heard from you last week on this. You want to, Jeff?
Does it need repeating?
Well, obviously it does. They ask a question again.
All right. Well, I think, Alan is correct when you come together in one place to eat. So this idea of a virtual Lord's Supper. Now, I have expressed myself on this to several of late. If I'm excused from the assembly, I'm excused from the supper. So the question is, am I excused from the assembly? And if I'm not excused, that is, I don't have authority, then I need to be there. if I am excused, I don't need to be there, and I don't see the need to be concerned about the Lord's Supper, because when you come together to eat, and Alan is right on point on that, so I agree with you. The mistake that some make, and this may be more than what I said last week, the mistake that some make is that they either come to the conclusion that the local church is the unit of communion. In other words, it's the church that eats the supper and not the individual. 1 Corinthians 11 says it is the individual that eats the supper, not the local church. And then secondly, others have the idea that somehow the church dispenses the Lord's Supper. And that's not true either. It is not a sacrament or an ordinance. It is a memorial. And so when you come together to eat, the idea, some have had the idea, well, I've heard my brethren argue this from the last verse in that chapter, tarry you one for another. Well, if we're going to tarry for one another, we're never going to eat the Lord's Supper, because I don't think I have ever been in the assembly where there was 100% attendance of all the members of the local church.
Amen.
So the church is not the dispensing agent, and it's not the unit that eats, but rather the church comes together. And personally, I think more than anything else, the idea of assembly is what's in view in 1 Corinthians 11. So I'm not going down that path. I tell my brethren I don't think they need to be concerned about that. But at the same time, I don't want them locking the church building doors and telling people they can't come and assemble, even though some may choose to absent themselves from the assembly for what justifiable good reasons.
Engineer Dave.
Penny commented on Facebook and said, I had a person tell me that since they were watching this, that they were not alone and could partake.
Okay. They
are alone. Or their wife is present, or husband, whatever.
Well, there's two ways I can take that. You need to explain that I alone a little bit more. I'm sure the people who think of the virtual church are saying that they're not alone, that everybody's there virtually. But I suspect she may be, I'm assuming it's she may be thinking of a husband or children or something like that. Which gets us back to the subject we discussed last week, and that was the passage in Matthew about where two or three are gathered together. You want to go back over that?
Well, the passage is not even talking about an assembly. The passage is talking about the agreement of the witnesses that were giving testimony in the discipline issue that occurred in the previous verses. And so where two or three, it's the principle of two or three witnesses establish the truth. And so wherever that is the case, then the Lord is with them in that. That's the idea there. Now, if we're asking the question, can two people be a local church? We've dealt with that on many levels in different situations, but two people can be a local church, but those two people are not necessarily the church just because they happen to be together, or they happen to be in business together, or they happen to be in opposite ends of the boat fishing. The capacity of a local church involves agreement. It involves commonality in the treasury and oversight and so forth. And it involves their joint participation in the case of the Lord's Supper. They've all come together to eat. And you can't get around what 1 Corinthians 11 says, one place. A virtual assembly is not one place. If this is the case, then we're going to have the universal church activated because everybody has a computer screen, and I am not going down that road.
Thank you. You were going to say something else, Engineer
Yeah,
Dave?
you've got several comments, actually. One from Gerald, who says you can... Oh, sorry, it just moved on me. I hate that. You can come together in mind and spirit, and you are assembling in a common worship. The point of the passage in question is that they were treating the Lord's Supper as a common meal. Now, this...
Well, that's true, but the text is in one place.
Now, this next comment is from Graham, And he says, I agree with assembling first day for partaking the Lord's Supper. I've seen some go to 1 Corinthians 10, 16 through 18 to more or less state it in a spiritual communion we share. This would be permissible. Do you have thoughts on that? And then Gerald, can I keep going? Or you want
No, let's take the passages as they come. 1 Corinthians 10, the cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we being many are one bread and one body, we are all partakers of that one bread. And so I get the feeling, read that again, Dave.
Which one?
The one on 1 Corinthians 10.
Okay. He says, I agree with assembling first day for partaking the Lord's Supper. I have seen some go to 1 Corinthians to more or less state it is a spiritual communion we share.
Okay, I get the feeling. Do what?
That's not even what the passage is talking about. Paul's talking about effect or commonality in the sacrifice of Christ. He is not talking about the fact that they are all eating the Lord's Supper in a spiritual assembly. That is not what the passage is saying.
I got a feeling you're missing the guy's. He's not taking it as his position, just somebody else.
It says somebody else takes the position.
So I got the feeling he's activating the universal church, that everybody in the world is taking the cup of blessing, and everybody's taking the body.
That's what they would be saying, but Paul is not talking about an assembly. Paul is talking about the effects or the reality of their communion in the fellowship of Christ, or in the fellowship of his death. They all share in the same body, they all share in the same blood, and it's a metonymy. The bread is the body of Christ, the cup is the blood of Christ, and it's cause and effect that Paul's talking about. He doesn't have an assembly in view in chapter 10. He doesn't take up the assembly until he gets to chapter 11, and he specifically says in verse 20, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. So eating the Lord's Supper requires them coming together in one place. Whatever is in view in 1 Corinthians 10 doesn't have anything to do with an assembly. He hasn't even brought up an assembly yet.
You have been silent for a while. Do you want to join in on this?
Other than just know that, again, we got to ask ourselves, what, if this is a, if this, you have to ask yourselves, what's the consequence of if you believe this is a spiritual assembly and not a physical one? Well, as I think Jeff realizes, and I think as I've tried to point out, if that's the case, then it kind of renders verse 33 somewhat meaningless. My brother, when you
11.
Yeah, yes, sir. Chapter 11 and verse 33. I'm sorry, I should have been more
So
specific.
you got to eat cherry one for another.
Yeah, and
What it does is and I know people don't have any difficulty in doing this because they do it every day, but they involve the apostle in self-contradiction. He cannot be saying we assemble virtually or spiritually while at the same time requiring that they assemble literally in one place. That's self-contradiction.
Well, I think verse 22 also figures in, where he asks the question, what, have you not houses to eat and drink in?
Exactly.
So he makes an obvious distinction between that, what you do in your house privately, and what you do as an assembly with the other brethren, as a come together situation. Yes, sir.
Okay, we're getting several comments on this, and some of the comments, if you don't mind, because we dealt with this last week, I feel like some of them are redundant.
Well, let's see what they say.
Okay.
Some of them what?
Well,
Redundant.
In that case, Gerald says these are difficult times and we need to think and behave in a mature fashion given that it is dangerous to meet when we stand the chance of infecting others to the point of death.
Okay.
Penny says, this is response to the thing before this, I am a widow and alone, but then she also responds as you guys were going, where two or more are gathered, there I am in the midst. Quotation marks.
Let me, Penny, let me see if Jeff said it well, but let me tell you, that passage does not define a church. Two people don't constitute a church just because there's two people. Two people taking the Lord's Supper together do not constitute a church. There's oversight. There's a common function. In other words, teaching the gospel, educating the brethren, benevolence for the needy. All of those are common work to the church. There is those acts of worship, singing and praying, and the Lord's Supper that the church is to engage in when they gather. Now, yes, you can sing and pray and do some of those things at home, but just taking the Lord's Supper together does not mean the church is in action there. There's also oversight. In other words, there's some government in the church. So I think that's the point. I don't know if I said it any better than Jeff. Probably not, but at least repeated it. Go ahead, Engineer Dave.
Okay, and then Rita commented with a question. Do we put more importance on the Lord's Supper than on singing, prayers, teaching, and etc.? Aren't they all equally important?
I think that's a good question.
We all know in times past that some congregations took the supper to those in the nursing homes. And then Gerald comments again. He says, it is symbolic of the body and blood. It is not actually either, which does not make it any less real.
That's true. What was you quit reading two of these at once? You know me. Can't remember.
Rita, do we put more importance on the Lord's Supper than on singing, prayers, teaching, and etc.? Aren't they all equally important? Yes,
Yeah, I think
we can agree with
that. A lot
that.
of people do put more importance on it, but
Yeah,
they shouldn't.
and we all know in
But-
times past that some.
Let me say this: these people who are doing this virtual church, I assume they're trying to get everybody to sing together on Zoom or something and pray together and all that sort of thing. That would probably be their response. Being devil's advocate. Go ahead. Now the next one.
Okay, the one I already read.
Run after, yeah.
Okay, from Gerald, he says it is symbolic of the body and blood. It is not actually either, which does not make it any less real.
Okay, next. That's it? We caught up?
We're caught up so far.
Okay.
Did you deal with that last part of Rita's? We all know in times past that some congregations took the supper to those in the nursing homes.
Okay. Did you do that?
I remember it having been done years and years ago when I was small, and then there was a discussion about it, and the church quit doing it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think from what we're reading in the scriptures, it would be a mistake. The mistake would be in taking it in your nursing home. The mistake would be in assuming that can stand in place of gathering with the saints.
Yes.
In other words, just because you bring the Lord's Supper out to somebody, that the command in 1 Corinthians 11 is to gather and to partake of this particular supper and other things when you're gathered. And so I think what a lot of people think is, I can't gather for one reason or another, but my conscience hurts me, and so I'm going to take the Lord's Supper even though I'm not gathering. You miss the point. If you're not gathered, there's no incumbency for you to take the Lord's Supper. You are, what we traditionally call providentially hindered. And I think all of us, and all of you who are listening, would agree that there probably are some times where we are providentially hindered by weather, by disaster, by this disease.
Yeah.
There are times when we are hindered from gathering and do not need to feel, as I think Jeff implied this earlier, did you? Do not need to feel the guilt of not gathering when, for one reason or another, we have been told
Uncontrollable circumstances,
yeah,
require it.
Yeah, if your car breaks down on the highway getting to church, the Lord doesn't expect you to grow wings and fly. And you don't need to suddenly whip out some grape juice and some crackers from the back of your car and say, well, I'm going to take the Lord's Supper. And that will be good enough. That's the same thing as gathering. It's not. You're not the church. Even though your wife's in the passenger seat, that you're not required. It's not incumbent on you to gather. And not being gathered, it's not incumbent on you to take the Lord's Supper.
You know, Rita's kind of got an interesting point here that makes me think a little bit. You know, are we putting more emphasis on the Lord's Supper? And I think the answer's got to be yes. If we're going to be taking the Lord's Supper into the nursing home so that person in the nursing home can have the Lord's Supper, or a cracker and some grape juice, well, are we not singing or not praying or not preaching and all the other aspects of that?
Pass the plate.
Yeah, and pass the plate.
1 Corinthians 16,
And,
which is to be done.
I've never heard anybody make that argument that we ought to.
Go hit up the nursing home patients for money.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't hear about make that.
That gives some thought that.
But 1 Corinthians 16 is just as definite that it's to be taken when we gather.
Yeah, more so because the idea of every first day of the week is in that passage.
Yeah.
I mean, it's implied in Acts 20, don't misunderstand me, but it specifically says every first day of the week when you come together. Let each of you in store.
What are we doing?
Okay. We had the comments are good, guys. Just keep them coming. And nobody heard me on that because I didn't have the microphone on.
Is he talking to us or is he talking to people?
He's mumbling into his pocket or something.
Penny says, yes, I know you are right. Randy says, probably need some lessons on the Lord's Supper and the differences in the local church and the universal church.
Okay. Is there a difference between the local church and the universal church, Jeff?
Most assuredly.
Thank you. I appreciate your keen biblical analysis there.
Now, the universal church, we talk about one body. All right, there's one body of which Jesus is the Savior, over which he is the head. This encompasses all who are saved by the blood of Christ. All right, so that's the one body, the church. This is what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 16:18. Upon this rock, I will build my church. All right, but then we have clearly local church under the church of the Philippians, under the church of the Thessalonians, and so on and so forth. Saints in a given place, and those, as Philippians bears out, have elders and deacons and saints. And so there's an organizational structure to it. And then they work together and they have a common treasury. First and 2 Corinthians makes that clear. That each of the churches have their own collection and each of the churches were responsible for their own collection. And when they sent part of it to Jerusalem, they each had their own messenger. They didn't commingle the funds and put them under a common oversight of some board or someone. There's an autonomous local church in each community, or there may be more than one, but they're autonomous, they're independent. They cooperate, but they're not tied together. That would be denominationalism. And then there's the reality that sometimes the word church, the lines get a little blurry on exactly what the context is talking about. For example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, we're baptized into the one body, which is the church, but clearly in application, what Paul is talking about in that context concerning gifts applies to a local church, but it would be true in all the churches. So there's the universal church, there's the local church, and then contextually, we have to go through and sort through it. Then there's the reality that sometimes the church is spoken of distributively, as in Acts chapters 8 and 9, when the church was scattered. Well, okay, it's the church, but they're scattered. And so you might argue, well, that's the local church. Well, perhaps it was, but it was the only church there was at the time also. And the persecution was against the church, just the local church, or just the whole concept of church. You see, they were persecuting elsewhere.
And
So
the idea, the point you're getting across is they're scattered abroad. In other words, this is not the church assembled. This is a church scattered throughout the community or throughout
yes,
throughout
yes,
an area.
yeah. So they're distributed, but they still have their connection, even as a local church. I mean, the church doesn't cease to exist just because somebody says amen at the end of the service. The church exists outside the confines or the boundary that contains it in an assembly. So, and that's why I say in 1 Corinthians 11, you've got to look at that carefully to understand, is he talking about an assembly or is he talking about a local church having some kind of authority with regard to the supper? Clearly he's talking about an assembly. See? So but the caller or questioner is correct. We need some lessons on it. We've always needed lessons on it because that's why denominations exist.
It's hard to make them emotional and
Yes, it is.
devotional.
Yeah, it's rather dry preaching. You know, I remember Ed Dye telling me years ago he went with Irene while he was still in one of the denominations, and she said, "What'd you think of that sermon?" He said, "Well, that was the driest preaching I ever heard in my life." She said, "Why'd you say that?" She says, "Because it was all Bible."
Alan, you want to add anything here?
I was going to read this comment from Nathaniel,
Okay.
if you want. And it says, if a group, and Dave, I'm sorry if I'm preempting you, but too bad. If a group of soldiers gathers in another place without elders, and when a term of station is long, how do Christians abroad deal with it when there is not a local group?
If you have brethren there, you form a church.
Yes.
A lot of military men have done that. They when they hit a base or whatever, they'll put an ad in the local military newspaper looking for other Christians.
That's exactly how the church in modern times was begun in Germany after World War II. Was American soldiers were stationed there on the various bases, and they advertised. Same thing here in the United States. There are many churches that exist because there were soldiers on a base who were Christians.
Yeah, and you put an ad in the paper, or you put an ad in the whatever military newsletter they've got, and say, "Hey, is there anybody else who's a member of the Church of Christ? Can we get together and meet?" And then you form a church with oversight. You'll have some sort of oversight in the group, and common purpose. You'll have common worship and so forth. So yeah, that's easily done. There's nothing wrong with starting a church, but there needs to be the intention of starting a church, not just, hey, there's two of us met for lunch today, and we had some grape juice and crackers. That's not a church. That's just two of you who met while you were fishing or over. Well, I keep using restaurant illustrations, which is kind of knuckleheaded these days. There's no restaurants. But anyway, maybe you see the point. Engineer Dave, how are we doing?
All right. From Graham, we have a comment on Facebook. He says, if we can at least find the good in this, we are all searching the scriptures to make sure we are worshiping in spirit and in truth in these unprecedented times.
I think it's a good comment.
I think so. It is a thing, and each congregation is going to have to make up their mind as to how they carry out the commands and examples in the Bible. I think that's important to realize. Each congregation will make up its own mind, and based on their understanding of what the Bible says. And yes, we need to come together. Each church needs to come together in spirit and truth. And it's obviously confusing a lot of churches in the country as to how to handle this. You know, it would be one thing if it was one Sunday, But my goodness, now it's going to drag on apparently through the month of April and maybe even further. So I think a lot of brethren are beginning to be very concerned about ignoring the Bible's commands about.
That's the next comment, as a matter of fact.
Okay, go ahead.
The next comment is from Larry, who says, I think the bottom line is we are not able to come together like those in 1 Corinthians 11. The something Ontario government, I don't know what the CDN, Canadian Ontario,
Yeah.
maybe, Canadian Ontario government has mandated that the doors of our building be closed, perhaps for several weeks. We are in uncharted position. In my mind, part of the reason is to proclaim his death till he returns, so I would think that God would want me to put that on hold for several weeks. It's a question. In my conscience, the answer to that is clear to me, but all should make up his own mind, our own mind, and that's a good point. And I might even suggest to you, Larry, yeah, we've been wrestling with that too. John and I and the other elder here, Bill Whitaker, have been wrestling with that too, and been approaching it from several different angles, including, if need be, we could conduct, I suppose, outdoor services, and therefore we're not in the building.
As long as it's not raining.
As long as it's not raining or not, blowing 40-mile-an-hour wind like it was recently. There where John and I are worshiping, we've instituted some very rigorous measures to prevent the spread of this disease, including having the men who are serving the communion wear gloves, rubber gloves, latex gloves, and even bought some of these individual packaged combinations of wafer and juice to hand out so that no hand is touching it. Again, we've been wiping down the surfaces with disinfectant. We've been going through very stringent measures.
What we've tried to do is abide by the CDC guidelines.
Exactly. Yes.
For our worship.
And that's prudent, and that's very prudent. But yeah, if the government were to come in and say you absolutely cannot meet, in the building, well, all right, maybe we'll find a way to meet outside somewhere, or in some way that we're not violating the government rule, but also making sure we have our observance toward God as we need to be, and finding a solution that works for everyone.
Yeah, and that's gonna vary, I think, from congregation to congregation, situation to situation. It sounds like the Canadian government is a little more stringent. We have a little thing called the First Amendment, which does modify something that the government can do, so that our government is largely making recommendations at this point.
Our governor sent out not a revised, but an explanation of the rules, and he made it clear, because we had two cities, one on the south and one up in the north, the mayors had said, well, we're going to close all the doors, including the churches. And immediately the First Amendment Association of lawyers here in Texas challenged that, and rather than go to court, both of the cities reversed their position on it. And the governor articulated that the churches they are designated in Texas as essential, and they are certainly not to be harassed or in any way prohibited from meeting, and no one is to be stopped or ticketed who is on their way to a public worship assembly. So there is no law in Texas, at least, prohibiting that, and it's been articulated and reiterated clearly. And I think that's probably going to hold true for most of the time. Now the question.
So here in the U.S., here in the U.S., the issue has been prudence.
Yeah. How do you do it?
Is it prudent, and if considering the questions of prudence, how do we go about it? And as I say,
I'm hopeful in 2 weeks we'll know.
I think you're maybe whistling in the graveyard.
Well, today I listened, and they're trying to, everybody says flatten that curve and all that, if you know what that means. But the peak is in 2 weeks, and we'll see if we're being successful. And
Well, I hope so.
I'm not saying it's going to be over in 2 weeks. I'm just saying that we may be in some areas be able to slack up a little and see. But I definitely believe that people ought to be allowed to do what their conscience and their good sense tells them they need to do. Nobody is that I know of is advocating that this is a substitute for the assembly, and knowing that it is short-lived or lived, however you prefer to pronounce that. I think we ought to forbear with one another till
Yeah,
we can get
I agree.
See the light at the end of the tunnel.
Amen. Go ahead.
All right, this comes from John on Facebook. He says, should church leadership start telling brethren, quit taking the Lord's Supper for the next few weeks or months?
I'm not going to say, I'm not going to go all out. I don't think the elders have that right.
No.
Well,
Amen.
You
if
know,
they want to take, if people feel that, if I view this taking the Lord's Supper at home just like I do baptizing somebody again. I have no way of knowing whether or not what they did the first time was what it ought to be. And so they kind of say, I think I need to be baptized again. Well, I'm not going to say, no, I'm not going to do that. You already dipped once. It can't hurt them. And it may help them. And so I show respect and reverence, and we talk about what baptism is for, and we make sure we're all on the same page. It may well be that was unnecessary. Likewise with the Lord's Supper. My conscience tells me that if I'm not in the assembly, I am excused from eating the Lord's Supper. I truly believe the Lord's Supper is restricted to an assembly on the first day of the week. People coming together to eat. I can't come together to eat, so I am excused. But here's somebody over here who thinks that they should eat this at home, and I'm not going to tell them they can't. But if they start suggesting that this is a substitute for the first day of the week assembly, and that somehow we're virtually assembling together, and we ought to start mail ordering the Lord's Supper elements for everybody in the local church so they can stay at home and eat, now we got a dispute. See, we're talking about it's not apples and oranges. So
well, I agree with you. I think if people, the assembly is on the first day of the week. Taking the Lord's Supper in the assembly is required. If somebody wants to take the grape juice and the bread 5 days a week, and they, in their heart, in their mind, they think that that's something religious and that they want to remember the Lord that way, that's up to them, their conscience. And I'm not going to tell them they can't do it. What they can't do is they can't assume that they're taking that in that fashion substitutes for the assembly on the first day of the week.
Amen. Amen.
And so, and
Yes.
the other thing they can't do is say that everybody else ought to do that. That somehow
Yes.
it's a biblical requirement, because the Bible doesn't require it at all. I've known of people who were baptized many times, not just twice.
yeah, I know what you're saying there, and in my mind it seems rather unnecessary.
Yeah. But if it's
Well,
in their conscience, they think that's what they're going to do. I guess my hands will get pruny doing it, helping them with it occasionally.
I just make sure that people understand in situations like that being immersed again is not a substitute for an acknowledgement that one has been living in sin.
Yeah.
And that somehow there's some connotation that everybody's happy about a sinner who's baptized, but very few are happy about someone who comes and confesses they've been sinning. That may say more about the church than it does about the person who comes confessing, but the fact of the matter is it still needs to be understood.
Yeah, let me read a passage that might get us back, or might give us some biblical validity to these thoughts. This is in Romans 14. Mm-hmm. Who art thou that judgest another man's servant? To his own master he standeth or falleth. Yea, he shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand. One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. He that regardeth the day regardeth it unto the Lord, and he that regardeth not the day to the Lord, he doth not regard it. He that eateth, eateth to the Lord, for he giveth God thanks. For he that eateth not to the Lord, he eateth not and giveth God thanks. So, at some point, this passage comes into play here. That man who wants to do this privately, that's his business. And in his conscientious relationship with God, that's his business. But he can't teach other people it's necessary, just like you couldn't teach other people that they had to keep themselves from unclean meats. That was wrong. That was unscriptural. If they wanted to forego eating bacon, they're a little out of their mind, but okay.
I'm having that for supper tonight.
Yeah, all right. But anyway, these are some thoughts. And you can't, if you take the Lord's Supper or take these elements privately, it isn't a substitute for the gathering at the church or with the church, wherein you take the Lord's Supper on that occasion. Go ahead.
All right. You got several comments here. One from Ed. I appreciate Jeff's comment. We should forbear one another. This should be temporary, and then we can be in one place again. Patience and forbearing one another. There is no need to judge others as unfaithful or being in sin for doing things according to their conscience. And then, Gerald, you asked, could I respectively ask that you read my previous comment about the reason we take the Lord's Supper, which I did read earlier, but I'll
Go ahead and read it again.
I'll read it again. I gotta find it. Oh, I lost it. There it is. It is symbolic of the body and blood. It is not actually either, which does not make it any less real.
Okay. Good point.
And then, again from Ed, he says, if someone asked you to take them the Lord's Supper at a nursing home for their conscience, would you do it?
That's asking me to abide by their conscience. I might give them a supply of these communion cups we're using these days and let them take it at their own opportunity.
I was going to say, if you're allowed in the nursing home.
Yeah, if I could even get in the nursing home.
Yeah, we can't even get in the nursing home.
I probably am not going to be the priest on that one, though.
That's all.
That's it? Okay. Yahoo. You've even forgotten where you're studying in Sunday morning Bible class, haven't you?
No, I have not. In fact, I've been waiting for you and ready for you on 1 John, because you raised the question last time we were able to meet on Sunday. On that Bible class, you'd raised the question about when was it written. I've done some research on that.
There you go.
And I'm prepared to discuss that a little bit.
All right.
And present some interesting arguments on at least a couple of the popular theories. But yeah, 1 John.
I know last week, I'm a little, I wish we could get together. It's so frustrating not being in contact with all our brethren here in the church. You can do it on the computer, you can do it on the phone. It's just not the same. But I know last week one of our sisters tried to and did have an online Bible class for some of our young children. Maybe you can study that passage in 1 John online at some point when you have the time and so forth.
Yeah, I would not mind doing that if I thought anybody was going to pay attention or watch.
Well, I would.
Well, okay.
Jeff would.
I would. I'm actually doing something Thursday night at 7 o'clock on Facebook. So.
Okay. Well, those are things that have to take place. Jeff.
Yes.
Is the church in Nacogdoches still meeting?
as far as I know, they will meet Sunday morning at 10 a.m. The It will not be all of us because some are choosing to shelter in place.
I understand.
But to my knowledge, they have not said we're not going to have the building available. So, and if somebody wants to go, I guess they could borrow my key even. But I mean, we've not taken the position that we're going to lock the doors and keep everybody out. But and then our guys are doing studies online and so forth during the week to augment the fact that we're not meeting Sunday nights and Wednesday nights.
All righty. Where is this church?
It's at 3831 Northeast Stallings Drive. That's on the Loop here in Nacogdoches.
I noticed on Facebook, this is just me noticing, you started a Bible talk?
Well, that's what I'm doing Thursday night. I'm going to, I've bought some equipment and I've been playing around with it and I've had some guys help me and I think I've figured out how to do, at least, if not call in, we're going to be able to do what we do here. We can take comments and questions anyway. And I'm going to try and do the old Bible Talk program like I did in Amarillo years ago. And just, basically stump the preacher.
Okay. Ed will be calling.
Yes, Ed will be calling. He'll be typing up a question, which is great. I hope he does. I like Ed.
All righty. The High School Road Church. This program is brought to you by the High School Road Church in Indianapolis, Indiana, 3103 North High School Road. And we are going to meet. We're not going to meet tomorrow night, of course, on our usual Wednesday night. We're not going to have Bible class on Sunday, but we are going to try to meet at 10:30 Sunday morning. If you are ill, stay home. If you are concerned about your health and your relationship with the government, for goodness sakes, stay home. But those of you who are healthy and want to gather with us, by all means, we will be there. Now, all of that could change based on what's going on in the world. And so we'll try our best. If there's some change in the situation, the circumstance, in the course of this week, we'll try to let you know. But our current plan is to meet Sunday morning, 10:30, for a worship service. And we hope that you will plan on coming out and being with us. It's been a really good study tonight. I know a lot of members of the church are very concerned about all this, and we appreciate your concern, and hopefully we've been some help to you. It's been good to be with you tonight, and if the Lord wills, we'll be back next week. I hope the Lord preserves us all so that we can be back next week. Good evening to you.